I joined at the end of '67, and I'd gone to college for a year and a half and just really hated it. And I was rodeoing, I was working, had an English teacher that I just couldn't stand. And me and him had a little blow up one day, and I walked out the door, got in my car, drove down to the recruiter, and went in and said, I want to join. So that's how much I had a buddy that had joined the Navy. So I sort of toyed with the idea mentally, but never had really seriously thought about it. So it was really on the spur deal. So I went to a destroyer out of Mayport, Florida, and they had a big storm blow in. And they took all the ships out and cut the engines to keep them from banging up against one another in the harbor where they were docked. And when we went in and was got out to the ocean, I think that was probably the sickest I've ever been before or since. Oh, I was miserable.
Wow.
And I I told the guy, I said, I have screwed up royal. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm not going to last. I said, man, I'm just not cut out for the Navy, evidently. And he said, said, you've got some college and you like animals, said, you'd make a corpsman. And I said, what does a corpsman do? And he said, oh, man, you'd go and work in the hospital. Said, you'd probably be at Memphis or Corpus Christi and all the pretty young nurses. And said, man, it's the best deal going. But said everybody wants to be a corpsman, and said it's an 18-week school, I believe. It might have been 16. I get confused on that sometimes. It's either 16 or 18 weeks. And so I had to extend to get core school. But I thought, and I asked him, I said, what about a ship like a destroyer? I said, they got corpsmen. He said, everybody in the Navy wants to be on a ship but you. And he said, they've got all kinds of people said you'd have to be a first class petty officer or chief to be on a destroyer as a corpsman, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. So I said, I want to be a corpsman. Well, I signed up for corps school, and when I got to San Diego, they had a building they called the Pink Palace. So, at any rate, when you checked in at Pink Palace, and when I was walking down the hallway, there's all these pictures of guys, all Medal of Honor winners, in Marine uniforms with the Navy insignia with the caduceus. And I asked the guy, I said, what's the deal with all these guys in the Marine uniforms? And he says, well, where do you think the Marine Corps gets their medics, their corpsmen? I said, I hadn't thought about it. He said, you will. He said, that's where they get all their medics. So whatever, I was into it then. So went through corps school. I was it was the best school. Hospital corps school, every subject, metrology, materia medica, pharmacology, everything had a purpose. And if you didn't pass every course in a 2 week period, you went back and started over with another group. That happened twice. And after that, you were kicked out. And basically, the rumor was you went to river patrol boats that leaked in South Vietnam.
Mm.
So I finished corps school, uh, got through it. And before you were eligible to go to Marines, now, not all corpsmen, Navy corpsmen are 8404 FMFs, which is Fleet Marine Force. Um, but all FMF 8404 corpsmen are Navy corpsmen. It's where that it's if you go through the training for it and qualify.
Right.
But before you're eligible to go to FMF training, you had to work on a hospital ward a minimum of 6 months or ship in some kind of a capacity dispensary or something. And I went to Guam. And Guam, I was on an airback ward, D2, and our ward, half of the fresh wounded Marine and Navy out of Vietnam came to us. The other half went to Yokosuka, Japan. And everybody at the hospital stood airback duty every other night. Being assigned to the ward really was kind of the best deal because you're already on there for part of your shifts anyhow. But if you worked all day, you had to be on the ward that night if you had airback duty. And again, you could be, if like I was working the ward, I might be my shift. Typically, the airbags would come in around midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning. They would land at Anderson Air Force Base, and they had buses they gutted and put stretchers in them, and they were just stacked, just like on a destroyer berthing area. It was just enough room to almost put your hand between them, where they had them lined up on those cots. So, at any rate, when they brought those into the hospital, we had a loading dock, just like a truck deal. They backed up, and we unloaded them all and put them all to bed. Typically, we'd run 60 to 80 fresh wounded a night. That would be everything from paraplegics to amputees to a guy that was allergic to malaria pills, and they decided to send him on home with the rest of the bunch that was coming out. So you'd have the very worst of cases, and you'd have some guys that weren't in that bad shape at all, and they were close to getting out, and they let them come as well. It was a real education, and I developed a tremendous respect for these guys, and but it was rough duty. It was the roughest duty I pulled the whole time I was in the service. I mean, Vietnam was a walk in the park compared to working that hospital ward. We'd bring them in, get them in bed, change IVs, check their meds, give them their meds. If they were able, they got a hamburger, French fries, and a Coca-Cola their first night. Next morning, they all went out to the various wards for whatever they needed treatment for. Then about 10 o'clock in the morning, here would come the guys that were either going back to Vietnam that had been treated, or there were guys going on to the States for further treatment. So they would be there for an hour or two. They would bus them over to Anderson. And that ward got stripped, waxed, buffed. The sheets were covered with, or the beds were covered with plastic. You betadine them. You did a lot of bedpans. You did a lot of colostomy bags. I think because they were treating them so fast that quite often they would put a colostomy bag on a guy temporarily just to kind of stabilize him till they got him for further treatment. Because a lot of the guys that I'd see coming through with a colostomy bag, I'd see them a week or two later going to the States or wherever, and the colostomy bag was gone. They'd taken care of the problem. So it was a different type duty. One of the things almost half the guys would ask you was when they come in, they'd be talking to them. They'd say, "Who are you with in Nam?" And I'd say, "Well, I haven't been to Nam yet, you know." And they'd say, "Well, I hope you don't go," or whatever. We had two guys that we worked with on the ward that had already been to Nam, two corpsmen. One we called Hollywood, and the other one was Doc Houts. And these guys would just go to them automatically. The wounded guys would. And they had a lot of respect for both the corpsmen that had been to Vietnam. And I was already getting pretty tired of Guam, and I was ready to go do something different. And so I went down and volunteered to go to Vietnam. And they were needing corpsmen. They were always short of corpsmen in Vietnam. So to go, I had to go back to Camp Pendleton for Fleet Marine Force training. Went through field medical service school, which was sort of about half first aid, and about half of it was, I don't know exactly how to phrase it. I think it's almost like another boot camp to where they were indoctrinating a bunch of Navy corpsmen into the Marine Corps way of looking at life. Right. And you did shooting, you climbed, you did a lot of PT and all of that stuff. And I got through that and really kind of enjoyed that. So I went to Okinawa and went from there to Vietnam. When we landed, I had orders to 1st Marines. We landed there at Airport 15 in Da Nang. They came in and got me and 3 or 4 more guys that were corpsmen, and took us outside and had to bring our sea bags with us. And I asked the guy, "So where are we doing?" And I thought it was getting late in the evening. I thought it was strange it was going to take us to where I didn't know where we'd be going to 1st Marines, how far or anything else. He said, "Y'all are going to 3rd Marines at Dong Ha." And I said, "Well, I got orders to 1st Marines." He said, "They just been changed." He said, "They're short of corpsmen." He said, "You're going to 3rd Marine." So I wound up in Dong Ha the next morning, and I was with 3rd Marines, not long, but I was up there with them for a time. Got outfitted up there, and then after about a month, I got back down to 1st Marines, and then got over to 1st Recon. And Um, I was lucky. I was lucky all the way around. We had, for the most part, we had the best officers. We had a high morale. Our guys were well motivated. None of us were perfect. They were short of corpsmen. I spent a lot of time when we were in the rear area, and these guys wanted to learn. I mean, they really did. We had a boy that had been in the Army and got out and joined the Marines. We called him Doggy McBride. He was one of our aid men, and we would give classes in the rear area, and sometimes one-on-one. Sometimes it'd be me with 4 or 5 guys, or another corpsman with 4 or 5 guys. Before I left Camp Pendleton, heading to Vietnam, there was a chief petty officer had been in World War II and Korea that I'd gotten to know fairly well. And he said, "Are you scared?" And I said, "Well," I said, "I'm nervous right now." I said, "I probably get scared." I said, "What I'm mostly worried about is what's going to happen when I'm needed and I lock up and I don't remember what to do." And he said, "You're going to do fine." He said, "I'm going to tell you what it comes down to." He said, "You've had the best training in the world and all that's good." He said, "When you get out in the field, it all comes to keep them breathing, stop the bleeding, bag them, tag them, and get them the hell out of there." And he was right. With Recon, um, typically, I think I probably carried more weight than any of the Marines did. And everybody carried more than their share because you're only out there with 6, 8 guys and you had to have enough stuff to take care of business. But when we went out, I wore my Unit 1 medical bag right here. I took my M16. I carried it with my arm resting on top of that bag. I'd have 10 or more magazines of M16 ammo. I'd have 2 IV bottles strapped here on my Ranger straps. I'd have my K-bar knife strapped here. I'd have a gas mask on my right leg. I'd have a claymore. I have a backpack with 25 HE rounds, 15 shotguns, 2 looms, 2 smokes, 2 arties, and 2 gases. Packed that a bunch with an M79s, what you fired all that with, a single shot. Some people call them blooper guns, some of them elephant guns. I had that strapped on top of that backpack. You had an ash pack with your chow in it. And then I'd carry anywhere from 6 to 8 canteens of water, depending on where we were going. And there again, if I had to have water in case one of my guys went into heat exhaustion or heat stroke, you had to have water there. And occasionally, when you got new guys, you had to really watch them on heat exhaustion and that. But I don't think I ever had a guy. I had people. I had an officer that we took out that got heat exhaustion like the second day. He had been in country very long, and I was going to medevac him, and he begged me not to medevac him. And I can do it. I can do it. So against my better judgment, we went on and we kind of. I talked to other guys. We kind of babysat him without him knowing what we were doing for a day or two, and he regrouped. He got okay, but I never had somebody play sick trying to get out of the bush. Everybody I ever went to the bush with, that's where they wanted to be, do their job, and get out. We got pulled off of Banah, which is one of the 3 highest mountains in Vietnam, on a ladder extract. And I didn't know it at the time, and we did some practicing with the ladder and with the spy rig. The ladder is a cable ladder they kicked out from through the hellhole on a 46 chopper, and then you climbed up on it. And of course, you had 2 gunships going around trying to keep all the heads down while you're getting on the ladder. And then they'd take off, and you'd go from being scared to death to being best carnival ride ever was. And they'd go back to a secure area and sit down. We'd do Medcaps off of our observation post, Hill 119. And there you'd be doing sick kids occasionally. You'd have a lot of kids that'd be injured by where they were setting off booby traps or near somebody setting off a booby trap for us that went off or whatever. And it was almost like a game to a point with our villagers. I got to where I knew them like I knew anybody, and I'd have my folks send me cigars from home. I'd have penny candies I'd carry in my pockets with me, and they all figured that out pretty quick, when they'd see you coming. And they would call the corpsman in Vietnamese was boxy. and they'd say Dinky Dow, or crazy. And they'd see me coming, they go, Dinky Dow Boxy, Dinky Dow Boxy, and they'd start hitting me up with the candy and cigars. We had one old one-armed woman that had lost her arm fighting the French back years before. And it was always rumored. And I think from what I've learned since I left Vietnam, I think the old woman probably was the head VC down there, to be honest with you. But every time she'd see me, she'd wear a helmet that she got in a Marine Army helmet, regular military issue helmet, and just had her sleeve tied up on that arm. And some of them referred to her as just a one-armed woman, and I always called her the one-armed bandit. And I'd see her coming, and I'd go, "Here's my one-armed bandit," and I'd hug her, and she'd go, "Boxy, Boxy, you dinky Dow, dinky Dow." And she'd go, "Oh, Dow, oh, Dow." And she was wanting something for her headache, which what she was wanting is me to give her some aspirin or Darvon so she could give it to the NBA that was down there watching us doing a Medcap. And I would sometimes give them, stuff like a little bit of aspirin or something, but nothing much. They were doing a lot of good. You trusted them to a point. You didn't trust them all the way, but you trust them to a point. We were down late one afternoon, and we looked up, and here come the villagers up Hill 119. And when you went off of Hill 119, they would bring them halfway up. And we would go down, and I'd do my Medcap deal and try to get them medevaced if I could. If I couldn't, bandage them best I could, or give them some meds and send them back down to the village and go down and check them the next day or whatever. And it was getting late in the day, and they knew what they were doing. This was a setup deal by the Vietnamese. And this young woman, the thing I remember most about her, she had some NVA bandaging on her. Wasn't no doubt about it. She'd already been treated by somebody with the NVA. But you could take her right cheek of her hip and just open and close it like you would a book. It was just one piece of skin holding that whole hip on. She lost a lot of blood, had a lot of shrapnel in her, and had a child with her. And the child was scared teetotal to death. And they had educated these kids, the little ones, that we would poison them, we would murder them. It was their media, basically word of mouth, that we were dangerous, not to trust us, not to get around us. Bigger kids had then found out that I was good for candy, so I'd had buddies running everywhere. But this little girl was too small to be aware of any of that. And so we called in for a medevac, and you had a routine, priority, and emergency. And I told Mark, I said, "We don't get this kid out of here, she's going to die." I said, "There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to lose her." And I got an IV going on her, which was really tough. This little fella, she was a small woman. She's like a little girl, really. But anyway, I said, "We're going to have to get her medevaced out." And so Mike Carver called in for a medevac. He had the radio. And the S3 in the back come back and said that the helicopters were all tied up and for us to leave her there. And we tried to medevac her the next morning. And I said, "Carver, tell him that we can't leave her here, that if we leave her here, there were bears, tigers, all kind of snakes. There's all kind of the odds of that kid being alive the next morning if we left her there was non-existent." And her people had all gone back to the Ville, which they had never done before. I think they knew this kid was right at the point of hopeless, and they knew if they were around that we might make them take her back to the village. So they'd left her by herself with this little kid. So this guy in the back to me, and I guess I was keyed up, came across being a smart aleck about the deal, and he said, "Well, I'm giving you a direct order." He said, "You leave her on the hill and go back up." I said, "I take my orders from the Dr. Anders," said the head surgeon with the first Recon. And I said, "We were in a unique position being a corpsman. We took orders. We did what the lieutenants and the sergeants told us to do, but we had a lot of leadway. And technically, I worked for Dr. Anders, who was a battalion surgeon. And so I knew that he'd get overridden, but I thought this guy may not know that. This S3 sitting back in the air-conditioned hooch telling us to leave his child on the side of the hill." And the Marines with us, and Mark said, "What are you going to do, Doc?" I said, "We can't leave her." I said, "Well, I'm going to just stay with her if y'all want to go back up on the hill." And we're not leaving you. We're not going to do that. So he called back again. And I said, well, at the very least, we need to take her inside the wire and see if we can get her out in the morning. And he says, no, you're not taking her back in the wire. He said, you leave her where she's at. And I said, if you think we're going to leave her where you're at, and I said, you can kiss my ass. I said, no. And boy, it got real hot then. A lot of stuff was being said. So they come back and said, you can bring her up in the wire. And I said, okay. So the girl, she was totally out of her head. I mean, she didn't have a clue where she was at that point. And the little girl couldn't be taking notes for the NBA. So we carried her in. I honestly didn't think she'd make it through the night. And I remember, I forget it was Ron and Jiminy, Boston, Massachusetts. I know Mark Bike, he tried to give the little girl some treats and actually had some Cracker Jacks. And the little girl was scared of him. And we had her in a bunker, and he took and had a little spin top. And he got to playing with that spin top, and he let it down, and she kind of got to playing with that. And the next morning, it was socked in, had to wait for the fog to lift, and the helicopter finally came in. And we loaded the little girl and the mama up, and the little girl was crying when we loaded the mama because she thought we were taking her mama away, and she didn't know what we was going to do with her. And Mark was trying to explain to her, and I don't know if I carried her. I think Mark said I carried. I don't remember. Somebody carried the child on the helicopter, and I remember she was grinning real big, when she got to her mama. I don't know if the girl lived. I don't know whatever became of them. When they left, that was it. But the night before, this guy in the rear area was going to have my bacon, for breakfast the next morning. And it turned out they were monitoring a lot of the radio transmissions back in the rear area. And they had some ARVN, South Vietnamese military, in there monitoring. And, the fact that they had 4 Marines and a Corpsman out there, and Parks, he was on the hill at the time, Lieutenant Parks, he was backing us, that, hey, we're not going to do this deal. So at any rate, we went from being zeros to heroes overnight, as far as helping take care of this kid. And, I like to think she lived. I don't know if she did or not. She was pretty messed up. But I seen some that you wouldn't think would make it that did. And I saw some you didn't think were barely injured that didn't. So, it's just hard to guess on something like that. We wore everything that the Marine Corps wore except the dress blues. You had to go through Marine boot camp to wear the dress blues, which is the way it should be. But they treated us like Marines. We treated them with respect, and they took care of us. They were short of corpsmen. They appreciated you.